It's my honor to introduce Congressman Gerry Connolly, representing the 11th District of Virginia. As a senior member of the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform and the Subcommittee on Information Technology, Congressman Connolly has been a champion of federal IT modernization for many years. Congressman Connolly is both a founder of the FITARA and dedicated to ensuring the congressional oversight of the legislation in the future. Interviewing Representative Connolly, it's my pleasure to welcome Tom Shoup, the Editor-in-Chief of Government Executive Media Group. So Congressman Connolly and Tom Shoup, I welcome you to the stage.
Thank you, Connie. Thank you to everybody for being here today. Thank you, Congressman. As Connie mentioned, Congressman Connolly represents Northern Virginia in the House of Representatives. What she did not mention further in his bio is he spent 14 years in local government at the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors, and I happen to have been a constituent of yours at every level of that service, from the Providence District to when you were chairman. And so I don't want to put you on the spot or anything, but my vote may be on the line here.
So. Yeah, hopefully you're a happy constituent.
Yeah. No comment. Just kidding. As Connie mentioned, you're known as one of the founding fathers of FITARA. So 2 years in, how's your baby doing? Is it adorable still, or are we entering the terrible twos?
Well, I think it's moved from crawling to walking. We're going to solid food now. No, I look. Change takes a little bit of time. I've been very impressed, actually, with, first of all, the level of interest. I mean, after we passed FITARA, I've probably been to 24 or more meetings like this, groups like this, talking about a piece of legislation. How often does that happen? So the interest has been great. And I think, by and large, the support we've had from the CIO community and the federal agencies has also been really quite striking. And if anything, their concern is impediments to their being able to implement, and that's something we have to try to address. I think GAO and OMB have been great partners. Gene Dodaro and company have done a great job in highlighting why federal IT management is a high-risk item, and why we have to address it. And they were fully supportive of the legislation and its subsequent implementation. And Tony Scott and his team at OMB, I think, have done a wonderful job of trying to facilitate implementation. And that's a level of cooperation we didn't have before at OMB when we were writing the bill. So I've been pretty pleased, and I've seen progress in the scorecards. And we haven't been facing resistance. We've been facing, how do I implement this? How do I overcome the hurdles I face within my agency? And so I'm feeling pretty good. I think that it still has the potential to be transformative and free up resources. We're trying to do some backstopping on the Hill and have our own problems in terms of CBO scoring and the like, not for FITARA itself, but for complementary legislation we're trying to get through. So we've got some work to do in 115th.
Great. You mentioned the scorecard, and there was a hearing last week about that. So on the latest scorecard, 12 agencies improved their grades, 11 held steady, and 1 dropped. Overall, how satisfied are you with that level of progress?
Well, in an ideal world, everybody gets an A, and we're counting the efficiencies and the savings and talking about all the transformative things we're producing. The real world's more complicated than that. Things take time. The purpose of the scorecard is, as I've said before, not to put a scarlet letter on someone's back, but to measure progress, to set benchmarks, to set goals for ourselves, and try to meet them. And I have been pleased with the progress by and large. There are some areas in the scorecard where we can and should do better. There are some agencies who I think have fallen behind. In some cases, it's a matter of, frankly, being delinquent on reporting. And had the reporting been on time, the scores would have been better. So, and we're not about, some rigid bureaucratic game of, well, that's too bad. I mean, we want to capture data as best we can and try to reflect the progress being achieved in an agency and exhort, encourage, and support the CIOs, especially in implementing that. So we're going to probably expand the scorecard a little bit more to capture all 7 pillars of the FITARA legislation if we can. We do want to focus on clearly measurable items. For example, data center consolidation. That's a very measurable item. You either consolidated or you didn't. You've got a larger number or a smaller number. Whereas the expansion and imputation of additional powers and flexibility to a CIO who is sort of first among equals in an agency, harder to measure that, harder to put a score to that, and a little more subjective and a little more complicated. So we understand that, and we're trying to stay flexible, not rigid in the scorecard, but we do think it's a management tool that can help everybody involved push toward full implementation of FITARA. So a long-winded way of saying, actually, I'm impressed, and I'm, very hopeful that we're going to continue to make progress. I do worry in any presidential transition that we're going to lose some momentum, that it's going to take 3 or 4 months to sort out who's who and who's got the power and how does it work and where's the restroom. And I don't want to lose momentum. And, my candidate didn't prevail in this election, despite having 2.85 million more votes than the other guy. So I don't know who we're going to be dealing with, either in the transition or in the government itself. But my hope is we will continue to make this progress, and I think we have enough pieces in place to keep the momentum going.
In terms of this is the 3rd edition of the scorecard. In terms of the overall progress, you mentioned agencies working their way up. Are they on the path that you think that we're going to see relatively soon, agencies moving into the A range and really making the most out of implementing this law?
I think some agencies will. Human nature sometimes, look at, for example, high-risk projects. How good of a job have you done in your agency in identifying, projects you got that, are really high risk? Well, I mean, some agencies have said we don't have any in that category. Well, that's absurd. I mean, you've got a multi-billion-dollar systems integration contract, and apparently nothing can go wrong with that, really? But there's a risk as a human being, right, in saying, well, I'm managing a high-risk project. In other words, it could fail, or it may not meet the goals we set for it, or I may have to pull the plug or make some really radical mid-course corrections at these various milestones. It's a little bit hard to admit, and you want to be careful that it doesn't reflect badly on you and all that good stuff. So trying to get a culture change where we're acknowledging the risk factors up front and trying to monitor them as we set milestones for projects, as we do in the private sector, is a culture change. And so it takes a little bit of time. Look, even the hierarchy of who's in charge. If I go to a private sector entity, no matter how big, go to Northrop Grumman, Lockheed, or Marriott, and I ask the CEO, how many CIOs do you have? They look at you like, is this a trick question? Well, we have one. Well, in 24 federal agencies, we have 250. And that is a recipe for nobody's in charge and nobody's accountable. So We didn't by fiat change that in the legislation, but we're encouraging a cultural change to imbue, if you will, a primus inter pares, first among equals, to have the power, to have the responsibility, to have the flexibility to make decisions and to take responsibility for them and implement them without radically altering the culture overnight. And we're hoping that evolution will ultimately yield a management system on the CIO side that allows full implementation, accountability, and frankly, better management of our assets.
Do you think that's something you might ultimately have to address legislatively?
Yes, if what we've done doesn't work, then yeah. But here's the problem. Generally speaking, you know what I always say about Congress, we don't do nuance. So when Congress gets in the act, right, usually it's a fairly crude way of doing something. So I mean, we'll lose some flexibility. We'll lose some ability to exercise judgment by codifying it all. And that's what we tried to avoid doing in FITARA. In FITARA, we tried to create a new culture, that exhorted, encouraged, set goals, allowed us to measure ourselves about how we're meeting these goals with some end objectives that were laudable and we thought achievable, and it requires cooperation. If we can't make that work, then we'll have to look at alternatives. I think it's way too early to make that judgment, and in fact, I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing. So I don't think that's going to be in our near future. There are other areas, and maybe you've got them, Tom, to ask me about, but I mean, I would give as an example of where I think are going to have to legislate is FedRAMP. I think FedRAMP's been a failure. I think the federal government has done a miserable job of, with a laudable goal, but I mean, something that was supposed to streamline certification, make it easier, and encourage more people, more entry, more people to get in, has had exactly the opposite effect. It's cost more and taken longer, and it's actually discouraged people from wanting to get in. And I think we're going to have to legislate that fix because I don't see GSA managing this anytime soon.
To get back to the scorecard for a second, one of the areas that you're rating agencies on is empowering CIOs with the authority they're given under the law. And that's an area where agencies are still kind of coming up short. 9 got Fs in that category and only 5 got As. What can Congress do to spur progress in that area?
I think we have to look at how some agencies are organized and to whom does the CIO, the primary CIO, report. There has to be a line in the org chart to the head of the agency. If the CIO is delegated to deputy assistant to the assistant, in the reporting sequence, I think it says something about the elevation of those responsibilities and that whole subject area. And this is also a cultural change. So most people who get to head an agency are mission driven, and that's a good thing. So I'm in charge of, a piece of healthcare, and I'm in charge of it because I come from the healthcare background, right? So I'm a pediatrician or an oncologist, or I was a nurse or a doctor, and I really care about this mission of providing healthcare to the most people at the lowest cost. IT is just a tool for me to do that, and it's, the management of that's buried in the bowels of the agency somewhere, and I'm frankly not particularly involved in that or even care about it. I treat it as a technicality that ought to work like my car should start in the morning. And, we want to, the problem with that mentality is, well, what could go wrong with that? Well, we saw that when we unveiled the website for the Affordable Care Act. Well, that IT piece you thought was technical and taken care of in the bowels of the agency actually turned out to be dispositive in terms of the whole program. And because of its initial failure, there was a lot of negative reaction about the whole program, about all the policies, all the goals, all of the programs that you hoped would be so revolutionary and so beneficial to the American people. So the IT piece is not incidental to the mission. It's integral to the mission, and you need to elevate its importance within your agency. So that's the theory and philosophy. We're trying our best to promote that by having our oversight hearings, by the scorecard, by developing benchmarks, and this insistence on accountability in terms of implementation. And I think once the new administration, this was something I hoped we'd do in this administration, but we ran out of time. But I would hope, frankly, we'll have full committee hearings where we call secretaries of, cabinet secretaries to our committee and ask them to account for themselves in terms of FITARA. That will get their attention. Mm-hmm. And that will help make the point that the CIO needs to be an integral part of your management team.
Did the healthcare.gov failure, did that actually end up having some positive effect in terms of drawing attention to things like FITARA?
It absolutely helped us. We had already, I think at that point, passed the FITARA in the House, but it absolutely made our case for us in the Senate. That this was not some techno-nerd thing that we were,
Not that there's anything wrong with techno.
No, not that there's anything wrong with that. That two of us were obsessively focused on in the House, and it became. I mean, we didn't even have to make much of a case for why this was important when that happened. So in that sense, it had a beneficial impact on the Congress, and gave us some real momentum in terms of passing the bill.
I want to get back to the issue of reporting authority and CIOs reporting to the secretary or the deputy secretary. So you've noted that on the scorecard for the first time with a plus if an agency did have such a reporting structure and a minus if they didn't, which ended up with what I thought were some interesting grades. I won't name the agency, but one got an F plus, which is kind of not the grade you want to bring home to mom and dad.
Well, you might as well mention the agency as public information. It's not a secret.
Department of Transportation, which actually will be hearing about that later.
Why did you name that agency? Trying to embarrass DOT here?
They will have their chance later this morning. At any rate, do you think that calling agencies out on the scorecard on this issue will have an effect?
Yes.
And where would you assess, it's 12 do have such a reporting structure and 12 don't, and how is that? How would you assess those results?
Well, look, let's reverse engineer the question. If we had no such reporting requirement and we had no such scorecard, there'd be zero pressure on agency heads to even address the topic. Now there's an external threat. You're going to be embarrassed if you're getting an F plus. I never heard of getting a plus with an F, but you've got to explain yourself. I mean, at the very least, presumably, a curious cabinet secretary says, "What the hell is this, Tom? We got an F in something. What's this? Tell me all about this." And somebody has to initiate a conversation about it, and we're injecting the reform concept at the top. So I think that's a good thing, and I think, frankly, without the this pressure, nothing would change. And again, what we're about is trying to change the culture. Some agencies are better than others. Some have lots of moving parts that make it harder to get to full implementation or a better grade, and some highlight the fact that at the top it's either indifferent or hostile to what we're trying to do. And if we can isolate that, and we only, in this case, we have one agency, that seems to be the problem child, well, we can work on that.
In terms of that,
I think you're going to hear from DOT later, and
yes.
I know he may, I think, expound on some of the complications of DOT, but I know he wants to do a better job and to definitely come out of this with a better grade. So he's not the problem.
Yeah, and I was going to say, just to pick up on that point, you talk about cabinet secretaries looking at these grades and saying, hey, what's going on? Does that conversation sometimes going to happen in reverse, where a CIO is going to say, listen, you're not giving me the tools I need to do this job the way it needs to be done?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think we've created, we've created some dialectic here that's a good thing if you want to effectuate change, positive change in an agency with respect to how it procures and manages IT. And in fact, how we go from treating it more like a commodity to be purchased and more like a transformative tool that can really change how we do business.
So with greater authority for CIOs comes greater responsibility. In your judgment, are agencies doing a good job of picking CIOs to take on these new roles?
Yeah, I've been very impressed with the cadre of CIOs we're dealing with and that I meet with both privately and publicly. I think the GAO is a very important ally here in providing support for that cadre. And I think a lot of them are reporting serious improvements within their agencies in terms of the culture of cooperation and the support they're getting from the top. Some less so. But what they do know is there's a whole bunch of allies now, inside and outside your agency, who are going to support you on the Hill, at OMB, and hopefully within your agency. So you're not alone in trying to pioneer some reform likely to get your head chopped off sooner or later because of the non-supportive culture within. It's quite the opposite. We've created a dynamic that says, why wouldn't you support her? She's trying to do all the right things, and we've got her back, and we're even giving her a better grade, so why aren't you supporting her? And from my point of view, that's exactly the kind of dynamic we want to create, because that supports transformative change.
One of the authorities that CIOs get increasingly is budget authority. How important is it that they step up and do things like kill failing IT projects to show that agencies are serious about this?
I think it's really important. And we'll try to have your back on the Hill. In the private sector, when something's going south, the ability to pull the plug and make a decision, this isn't working, we're going to cut our losses and move on, is, a key ingredient to basic management. But if you look at this green sign here that says move to Q&A. Thank you very much.
I'll be the judge of that.
Anyway, I just I think it does make a big difference, and we'll move on to Q&A.
Before we do that, I did want to ask you one question.
She's going to be angry at you.
I know.
She's got that kind of, it's cold, I'm tired, and I have to hold up the sign.
But I've been granted
All
authority under procedures to. IT modernization. You mentioned agencies spending billions of dollars on maintaining legacy systems. And the House passed the Modernizing Government Technology Act, but it did not pass the Senate. So where do we go from here on providing the funding that agencies need?
This is a great example of where Congress has put itself in a straitjacket. So Will Hurd and I wrote this bill, and it's designed to do two things. One was to authorize an IT investment fund $3.1 billion. So agencies would have a catalytic fund to try to make some of the replacement investments they need to make to, retire legacy systems and the like. And then the second thing the bill does is to allow agencies that do effectuate material savings from implementing FITARA to be able to keep those savings and reinvest in themselves. And so that we're not penalizing somebody. Great, you implemented all these reforms and you saved, $600 million. Thank you very much. We'll take that. As opposed to, no, actually, you get to keep that $600 million and reinvest in yourself to accelerate this replacement of legacy systems and to make sure you're, getting state-of-the-art technology that can be encrypted and protected and so forth and so on. So we write the bill, and it passes the House, and we're waiting for action in the Senate, and the Congressional Budget Office decides to score our bill. And they score it at a cost, I think, of $9 billion, Andres? Now, here's their logic. So I'll use I appropriate $1 for your agency, and they've scored that $1. That's $1. It cost $1. You're going to spend all of that $1, scored at $1. Now, if I say, well, actually, we have a process called FITARA that might allow you to save 30 cents of that $1. You're only going to have to, you're only going to have to spend 70 cents of that $1, and you're going to free up another 30. They have decided to score that 30 because that's 30 if you fully implement that you might not spend, and that could come back to the Treasury, and the fact that you keep it and spend it like you were going to spend the whole $1 gets scored twice, as if it were newly appropriated 30 cents when it's the same 30 cents. Now, in my simple mind, $1 is $1. We already scored it, and what you do with that extra 30 cents is immaterial. We've already scored it. And not in the world of CBO. And so, as a result, they've really made this complicated. In a Republican Congress, in both the House and the Senate, if we don't address this issue somehow successfully, it will kill the bill. So it's an absurd methodology, and it's an example of Congress giving CBO an infallibility the Pope in Rome would envy.
Okay, so now I would like to get to your questions. So if anybody has a question.
I was promised there'd be no questions.
Hi, Mary Ellen Condon. I'm a former gov and in industry, so I'm going to ask you about FedRAMP. I'm not a queen of FedRAMP, so it's not like I have a personal interest in it. But I think some of the problems with FedRAMP are the classic ones that FITARA points out. Resistance to change, resistance to accepting somebody else's opinion of a security assessment, and the divergence of the enterprise architectures. So it's very difficult to put things in. So could some of the issues associated with FedRAMP be resolved by having more, weaving it into FITARA and really having it as a management tool set to bring better security to the organization?
Yeah, I think the answer I think might be yes. We were actually looking at my original version of the Management Act that Tom asked about would have had FITARA addressed in the bill. For various and sundry reasons, we were urged to separate the two and address FedRAMP in the next Congress come January. There are things, let's remember the original goals of the FedRAMP process. So it was designed to streamline so it would take you maybe 6 months at the most, and maybe cost you $250,000, would create this mechanism for a joint review board that would certify. And you could take that certification and use it anywhere. So what happened? Well, the $250,000 average cost is now in the millions. 6 months is now an average almost of 2 years. And the joint certification is worth nothing. Ironically, one of the agencies on the joint board that certifies is one of the agencies that requires, no, that's fascinating, you still need to go through our agency as if you hadn't gotten that certification at all. I won't name the agency, the Defense Department, because Tom and I are not calling agencies out, as you heard. But that's crazy. I mean, and we had a session last year on FedRAMP only. Room was, but that's crazy. I mean, and we had a session last year on FedRAMP only. Room was filled, standing room only. So I began, and I said, okay, how many people in the room think FedRAMP's working? Every federal rep, their hand went up. They thought it was just fine. And then I said, okay, how many think it's not? Every private sector hand went up. And I turned to the federal managers, I said, you know, you're living in an alternative world here. It's clearly not working. And you're in denial, which makes the problem worse. And by the way, forces Congress at some point to say, okay, we're going to have to fix it. And I can tell you one of the things in any legislation is going to be the requirement that if you get that JAB certification, it's good for every agency. There won't be 2 certifications. There'll be 1. And you brought that on yourself by this craziness of saying that's all fascinating, but it's ad referendum. You know, you still have to go through it all over again. That's not what it's designed to do. So we're going to streamline the process come hell or high water, and I'd much rather have it be done within, administratively by GSA, but I'm not hopeful, given the track record. There was someone over here. Did we scare you?
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
So maybe looking at FITARA in the future, changes to it.
You know you can call it
additions.
Isa Connolly, right? Darrell and I kind of prefer that. We just think it's easier.
Is it-
Connolly Isa?
No, well, yes, it's Connolly Isa until Darrell shows up.
All right, so Isa Connolly 2.0. You mentioned a number of CIOs across the agencies, and I believe the number of CDOs is only 8. Any thoughts of adding in a requirement that the agencies add chief data officers? Because FITARA is a lot of questions, a lot of reports. And we've got a lot of data and a lot of CIOs that don't know what to make of it.
So your question is, should we include CDOs too?
Yeah, to add CDOs.
And add CDOs.
with
Sure,
reporting to
I'd be happy to do that. I mean, yeah. I don't know that we had really focused on that because we had really focused on CIOs, but there's nothing to stop that from happening. I agree. I mean, it's a good idea. We'll let us take a good look at that. Andres? CDOs.
So there's 3 pieces of legislation out there that kind of create a potential for conflict within agencies. There's the new Program Management Improvement Act that's just coming out. There's FITARA, and then you have the certification of program managers through usually the Chief Acquisition Officer's side. Is Congress going to do anything to make sure that these are deconflicted? Because you have OMB level oversight from each of those, but nothing that says that they have to play in the same arena or anything. So there's some struggles as to who's going to be responsible for what.
I would say we can use our committee to try to do some of that deconflicting. sometimes we have our own bureaucracy in Congress. So sometimes when you look at a legislation or committee action or whatever, and you ask yourself, why didn't they make it more all-encompassing? Or why didn't they include this or that? Sometimes the answer is jurisdiction. So like when we were writing FITARA, Darrell and I had to be very careful about anything having to do with the Pentagon, because in Congress's bureaucracy, the minute I start tinkering with the Pentagon, I'm in armed services jurisdiction and out of my own committee's jurisdiction. And they get real touchy about that. And it means sequential referral of the bill. So the way we wrote the bill, we had jurisdiction over it, period. Had we, had we not been careful about how encompassing the bill was, under the rules of the House, it would have been referred to the Armed Services Committee as well as our committee. And that, when you get 2 or 3 committees managing a bill or marking up a bill, that completely complicates the ability to bring a bill to the floor, to get it out of each respective committee, to make sure that the bill we've got now makes sense, because every one of those committees, is probably going to add something or subtract something to the bill. So sometimes from the outside, when you look at it and you think, well, why didn't Congress, very logical question, sometimes the answer is because we got our own bureaucracy, and sometimes that frankly makes it hard for us to produce a cohesive whole. So, but we will, you bring up another good topic, which is looking at both unintended consequences and this issue of deconflicting and harmonizing various requirements in this sector. And we'll be glad to do that. We'll try our best. And feel free to contact us too. Because the one thing we do have is agreement, a bipartisan agreement on our committee. We don't have conflicts on any kind of partisan level on this set of issues. And that's a great moment in time. There aren't many other things in this town you can say that about. And that means the 4 of us are going to continue as a team into the next Congress in terms of oversight and insistence on implementation. That continuity, I think, will matter a lot.
So you heard it here, Congress has bureaucracy too. We've reached the end of our time, but please join me in thanking Congressman Connolly for sharing.
Thank you all very much. Stay warm.